It is a shame about yesterday's European Union summit, where the relevant part of the final declaration was adopted without Hungary again. In the meantime, the price cap is in force in Hungary for the fifth day today, and I will also ask Prime Minister Viktor Orbán about the effects of the measure. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's start with the latter, the price cap, and take a step back, because there are many who evaluate this measure as an intervention in market processes. Why didn't the government wait for the market to sort this out on its own and for inflation to decrease?
Those who say that there was intervention in market processes are telling the truth. It would have been better if we weren't forced to do this. If a price increase is caused by market processes, then one can hope that market processes will also bring prices down. But here, the government came to the conclusion, studying the extent and pace of price increases, that there is no question of any market processes. I'll give you numbers. So the fact that the retail chains put 42% on chicken breast, 55% on pork chops, 68% on milk, 129% on dairy products, 38% on eggs, 69% on cottage cheese, 70% or 87% on yogurt. So compared to the fact that the retail chains purchase the goods, they charge such a high percentage. This has nothing to do with market processes. So the obvious thing here is that in the years following the regime change, the governments of the time were unable to create, and the Hungarian economy was not strong enough to maintain or create the retail chains in Hungarian hands. And these are in foreign hands. And they don't care about Hungarians that much, nor do they care about market processes. They care about their profits. And they put such huge amounts of money on the purchase prices. I had to intervene. I also prefer to live in an economy where such emergency intervention is not necessary. But we could not continue to watch people being robbed. This had to be prevented. Price increases had to be curbed, and those raising prices had to be told that this was it and no more. We tried negotiations first, but they didn't lead to any results, so we had to intervene.
Now, if we look at the experiences and effects so far, there are products whose prices have dropped drastically, while for others it seems to have dropped less. Overall, how do you evaluate the experience of the first few days?
The essence of the intervention was that we said that the retailer can add a maximum of 10% to the purchase price. That should be enough. Now this means that where they stayed within 10% of the purchase price, prices could not be increased further. And where they went above 10%, and I just mentioned some product groups, they had to come back below 10%. This resulted in an immediate price decrease. We are talking about 30 basic food categories. But if I break this down by product, it is several hundred products. We are now calculating that a price decrease can be observed in the case of 760 products. And this means a price decrease of well over 10 to 15%. We are constantly monitoring this. We are on it. I have no doubt that the retail chains will try something, but we are here too. And we will have an appropriate response to this. I would like foreigners to understand that you can't rob Hungarians. So they should understand that a 10% markup on the purchase price should be enough. I would like foreigners to understand that you can't rob Hungarians. So they should understand that a 10% markup on the purchase price should be enough. They couldn't do that at home.
There are some supermarkets that have introduced quantity restrictions on certain products. Others are expecting a decline in their income if the margin cap is not enough to curb inflation. So what further steps do you mean?
Well, there are still tools in our arsenal, but this is still a government. So now we are talking about the government of Hungary, and a government has many tools to intervene in market processes. The fact that it does not intervene every day does not mean that it does not have tools, but it means that we have a business and market-friendly government in Hungary, which would like the economy to operate according to its own logic, so that everyone can find their own calculations in it. If the market is out of whack, it must be adjusted back. We still have steps to take, but I don't want to threaten or put them in the future, because I trust that sooner or later foreign retail chains will realize that you can't win a battle against a government. They can only lose in this. Let's agree. Let them understand that there is an acceptable margin. No one disputes that. No Hungarian person disputes that. That all margins and all profits should be on their side, but 10% should be enough.
There are those in the opposition who believe that a VAT reduction would be, or should have been, needed instead of a price cap. Why didn't the government choose this tool to reduce inflation?
Some of those who argue in favor of a VAT reduction are ignorant, young, not experienced enough, and haven't lived through the history of previous VAT reductions. We have reduced VAT. We have reduced the VAT on many basic food items to 5%. This process roughly went like this. At the beginning, about 1/3 of the VAT rate was reduced. 2/3 were absorbed by traders, and within a year, the remaining 1/3 was absorbed. So we reduced the VAT, and after a few months, the prices were the same. Now there are young people who have just come into politics, or have not been leaders yet. They probably don't know this or don't understand it. And there are the old foxes, mostly leftists, who I have known for 1,000 years. They know exactly that this is the case, but they have always been on the side of the multinationals. So they want a VAT reduction. Means that money will go to the multinationals.
There was another important change in Hungary this week, as the parliament adopted an amendment to the assembly law for the purpose of child protection. According to critics, this restriction on the right to assemble is a restriction on the government's side, while at the same time referring to child protection. Why can't the current regulation of the right to assemble and the protection of children coexist?
In normal cases, this can coexist. It is unacceptable when sexuality, whether it is same-sex or opposite-sex sexuality, is taken out into the streets. Or it is unacceptable when all kinds of activists, such gender activists, want to go into schools, and instead of parents, they want to tell children when and what they need to know about this otherwise extremely complicated corner or detail of life. So normal people like us will be under constant provocation, because people who live according to non-traditional sexual behavior, which they otherwise have the right to do, no one interferes with their freedom. They take this out into the streets, and they don't take into account that there are a few million children living in this country who need to be raised with healthy people, given the opportunity to be happy in their lives, and the responsibility for this lies with the parents. And we simply will not accept this with all kinds of propaganda, whether it's books, films, school propaganda, or street actions. So we would like them to see that, in our opinion, freedom and child protection can coexist. Freedom has its place, and there is a way to raise children. And the child comes first. The debate in Parliament is now about whether the child comes first, and we are of the opinion that the right to a healthy upbringing of children is a fundamental right that is the most important of all fundamental rights, and that all exercise of fundamental rights must take this into account.
Critics of the legislation say that the government has banned Pride, but many people still say that who will be there if such a movement takes place? What can they expect? Because there have been a lot of suggestions about this in the past day.
This will happen at the end, so we are not there yet. We are now working on creating a legal situation that will allow the authorities, because this will be up to the authorities, to take a position on the basis of the law on whether such pride-like events can be held on the open street under the right of assembly or not. Either the rights of our children come first, and therefore this has no place and scope on the open street. This will be decided by the authorities later. In the current legal situation, the authorities would find themselves in a difficult position, given that it is not clear in Hungarian law what takes precedence: freedom or liberty, or the right to raise children. The rights of parents to raise children have priority. Who comes first? The marchers at Pride or our children? The Hungarian government's position is that our children come first. Everyone has to adapt to this. In this regard, a clear legal situation must be created so that the authorities can then act calmly and peacefully.
Let's take a step back on this issue, because you mentioned that the child comes first. But what actually led to the amendment of the Assembly law? What logical chain connects this amendment to the government's previous measures?
Well, there is such a connection, but I will tell you honestly that there is another circumstance here. I'll tell you, maybe I'm not causing much trouble, but I haven't watched all this calmly either. So I'll tell you honestly that I, as a family man, as a Hungarian citizen, as a person who is also concerned about the future of our country, as a person who feels responsible for the spiritual and intellectual state of the next generations that are now growing up, have always been concerned that such things could happen, that we should call this pride. But the truth is, and on top of that, I was the Prime Minister, and this could still happen. In fact, we had two of them in Parliament, and it still happened. And let's admit that part of the truth is that there was enormous international pressure. So behind my life, behind the attempt at sexual re-education, at the attempt at social re-education, there are huge international forces. We can also call this an international gender network. Well, ambassadors usually lead these main marches, the American ambassador himself, and there was enormous pressure on the government, both from Washington, since we belong to the Western world, that matters, and from Brussels. And we were simply not in the right state. We were not strong enough to face such a huge hurricane-like wind. But now the world has changed. At least in one place, in Washington, there are different winds blowing. Of course, we will have a conflict with Brussels. But a two-front war and a one-front war are not the same. I think the Hungarian government has to endure this one front. For the sake of our children, we have to try this. We have to try to win this battle internationally. There is a much greater chance of this now than ever before. The American change opened up the Hungarian government's room for maneuver to dare to take action and try to enforce the simple human law that the child comes first, then all other freedoms and liberties. As for the logic of things, we have been working on it since 2010, and it is also a personal matter for me to transform the entire Hungarian economic system into a family-centered economic system. This is not so simple, because everything we have become accustomed to in the last 30-40 years has not fundamentally considered families as the basis of the economy, but individuals. Finally, the name is also the giver of personal order, to mention just one example. But life seems to be such that, of course, everyone lives their lives individually, but it is significant that most of us still live in family bonds. And the family, as a community with its own special internal legal relations, special economic, human, and spiritual relations, has not been taken into account by economic regulation so far. For example, the fact that a child must be supported. And if a child must be supported, it is not the same burden as if you had not had a child. That's why we introduced the child tax credit. Or because the number of divorces is very high, and many families fail to stay together. Many women are left alone with the burden of raising children. Because the number of divorces is very high, and many families fail to stay together, many women are left alone with the burden of raising children. And that's why they are unsure from a young age whether to get married, and if so, when to have children. We need to have a say in whether they get any external support or not. That's why we're introducing a lifetime tax exemption for mothers with 2 children. But in the same way, in the school system, we're taking action against drug use, in the streets, in public safety. The ultimate reason for this all comes back to the fact that people want to keep their families safe. I say it again, behind our current, very harsh, police-like action against drugs, there is a family-supporting mindset, and the tax breaks for children that we are now doubling are aimed at the same goal. What we are doing in Hungary now, although it consists of many, now slowly dozens of steps, tells us a story. A story unfolds before our eyes, that Hungary should have an economic system that considers the family as the nucleus, the starting point, the smallest unit. This is a known danger, and the economy is organized around the logic of the family.
He mentioned that they expect an attack from Brussels. The first reaction came yesterday. The spokesperson for the committee said that they will not hesitate to react to this legislation. And there was also a protest in the parliament against the adoption of the law.
And then there were some members of parliament who lit smoke bombs. Others organized a demonstration. How do you see the reason for these violent opposition reactions?
Overall, this has nothing to do with Brussels. Although Brussels has become accustomed in recent years to taking away national competences from the member states, which is wrong, and we are fighting against this. So it is quite obvious that the issue of regulating family life is a clear and exclusive competence of the member states. Brussels has no business here. I could say this more strongly, that I would advise them not to focus on Hungary, but perhaps that would not be up to the standard of this program. As for the home affairs, I can say, well, look what happened. What happened was that the parliament began to discuss the constitutional amendment that would create the legal basis for the primacy of the family. And in response, some of its representatives took action, going so far as to resort to violence. I think that this is not something that should be decided by the political parties, representatives, or people like me. Then the voters will have their say on this when the time comes, and they go to vote. This is expected in spring of 2026. The verdict on the current parliamentary events will be given by the voters in the elections due next spring.
Speaking of Brussels, we are here today because yesterday there was a summit of EU heads of state and government, where, like the one 2 weeks ago, it once again vetoed the joint declaration on Ukraine, which calls for support for Ukraine and for its accession to the EU. How did you see yesterday how determined EU leaders and the prime ministers and presidents of the member states are on the issue of accession?
The situation is improving. It is not good, but it is improving. If you allow me, let's look at the current debates from a historical perspective. Let's do this so that we don't get scared. We don't need to be scared that there are moments when 26 member states say one thing and we take a different position. Because if we had been scared earlier, our country would be in big trouble. For example, it would be full of migrants. I remember when 26 people said about illegal migration, that we have to manage it, we have to live with it, we will solve it, he said. Angela Merkel is the Chancellor of the Germans, and we said, well, solve it if you want, and we will solve it by letting them in. And we were the only country that said no, built a fence, and took on the debate. Yesterday, there was a meeting where 8 to 9 prime ministers who are rebelling against the current refugee regulations were present, myself included. I was there. They literally say that Hungary said and did what it said 10 years ago. So there's no need to be afraid of being together, because sometimes it turns out that we're right. The same story is playing out in the war these days. I can already see in everyone's eyes that this war is lost. So it was the wrong decision to jump in. The Hungarians were right. When the Russians attacked Ukraine, they should have tried to isolate the conflict immediately, reach an agreement, and not expand the war. Hungarian families lost 2.5 million forints per skull, per household. In this war, I think the richer countries lost even more. So here, too, the moment will come when the Hungarian position will be the majority. Well, the Americans have already. I won't say that they joined us, because that would sound ridiculous due to the scale, but they have taken our position. The Turks have almost taken our position. The Slovaks are already speaking in the same tone as us, and I have already seen in the others here that the opinion is increasingly shifting towards peace. We are not in the majority yet, far from it, because yesterday the majority of states also took the position that the war should continue. Even more money, even more weapons for Ukraine. But this was no longer the same common will with the same border-like ferocity or steel hardness as before. The moment will come here, just like in migration, when the Hungarian position will become the common position of the European Union.
Now it comes to the Ukrainian accession. How determined were EU leaders yesterday, and how might a Hungarian referendum influence the political will in Brussels in a given case?
Well, the debate will take place in every country about whether Ukraine should join the European Union. And this debate is also taking place in our country. Political life is not unified in this. Let's say that the parties of the national side, the Christian Democrats and Fidesz, are clear that Ukraine's accession under the current circumstances that we know would ruin Hungary and the entire European economy, and is undesirable. On the other hand, there are pro-Ukrainian positions. Both the old and the new opposition say this, which is not surprising, because this is exactly the pattern of this debate here in Brussels. So, the patriots, to which the Christian Democrats and Fidesz belong, clearly say that only slowly with the body. The socialists, to which the DK belongs, and the European People's Party, to which the TISA belongs, are the most militant, the most radical pro-Ukrainian forces here in Brussels. Parties such as TISA, or whoever belongs to the socialists as a Hungarian party, such as DK, has no other choice than to represent the position that the party alliances represent here in Brussels. So, this debate must be fought in Hungary as well. On one side, we are the national forces, and on the other side there are TISA and DK, the People's Party and the European Socialists, who argue for Ukraine's rapid membership of the European Union. If we are beyond this debate, there will be a position developed by the people. Then the Hungarian government will be able to firmly establish its footing here in Brussels. The others won't be able to avoid it either. So it's only a matter of time before people in every single member state demand that their opinions be heard and asked for. Today, no one outside of Hungary asks people about such questions. This is not surprising because people have not been asked anywhere in Europe about migration, nor about gender. But now that the whoever belongs to the European People's Party as a Hungarian weight and consequences of this issue, the Ukrainian accession, are becoming increasingly obvious. I think European people will demand that they be listened to in every country. Votes start in April, end in June, so by the halfway point of the year, there will be a common Hungarian national position.
You mentioned the financial aspects, but if we look at Hungary, what areas of life should be affected? And in what form should a possible Ukrainian EU membership take?
This debate is just beginning. I don't want to come out with my own opinion too soon. I'd rather just say that the votes will be cast in April. This voting process will be completed in June, so by the halfway point of the year, there will be a common Hungarian national position. I recommend to everyone to consider all types of risks. There is an obvious financial risk here. I talked about that. There is an agricultural risk. I think our farmers would go bankrupt. Then there is a labor market risk, because tens of millions of people still come to the European Union who do not have a job at home or are looking for one. There is a security risk. Ukraine is not a country known for its public security, but all kinds of dangers could come to the territory of the Union. There are food safety risks because the production culture there in agriculture is completely different from ours. There are GMOs, chemicals. It's a different world. Then there is a pension risk here, so it would be worth going through the debate ahead of us, calmly and truly, point by point, and assessing what consequences Ukraine's accession to the European Union would have for Hungary. I think that from a bird's-eye view, this can only be a negative balance. We have enough problems without this. We shouldn't take this on our shoulders.
In addition to accession, the European Union is also pushing for support for Ukraine. Meanwhile, we see that the Americans are now negotiating with both the Russians and the Ukrainians on an almost daily basis about ending the war. How do you see it, or what was your experience yesterday? How mature is the European strategy regarding Ukraine or the post-war period?
I'm trying to find a good word that is not offensive to them and describes the situation. Maybe headless is the right word. They are out of sync here in Brussels. There is this idea that there will be a big negotiating table, and the parties involved will sit there. But you see, things don't go that way. That's not what the Americans do. But they make separate agreements with everyone. So suddenly we Europeans will find ourselves in a state where there is already an American-Ukrainian, there is an American-Russian, and a Russian-Ukrainian agreement that they created without us. This is the situation they are now facing here in Brussels, that this can be created, that Europe has messed it up. If this continues like this, our time will be over. There is no need for these agreements. It doesn't make me happy now, but it was also said at the current meeting that we shouldn't be surprised. Nothing happened that we hadn't foreseen because during the Hungarian presidency, it doesn't make me happy now, but it was also said at the current meeting that we shouldn't be surprised. Nothing happened that we hadn't foreseen because during the Hungarian presidency, in July, I wrote down everything we are in now. I sent it to every prime minister. I sent it to every European institution. I spoke to the Ukrainian boss, the Russian boss, the American and Chinese, and the Turkish boss. And I wrote in July that we will get here, so if the Europeans don't step in, if we don't change our pro-war stance and start to develop and represent an independent European line, then we will get to exactly where we are now. They will settle the future of Europe without us.